Okay, so as I said before, if you need to work ahead, work ahead. If anybody has a hard deadline, let me know so I can be sure to, I don't miss a grade deadline for somebody. All right, this week, let me share our screen. So autism spectrum disorder. Okay, there is an overwhelming amount of information about autism. Hopefully you have heard of it before, but just a quick overview if you really haven't heard about autism. So I like this. I really like how this site, and I feel like I haven't kept up on some of the very recent things in the last 6 months that have come out. But what I want to say is that typically speaking, signs of what I would say traditional autism, we can see very young, and we usually see the signs even before the age of 2. So some things to consider. So I like this. Signs and symptoms, and it goes to CDC. So typically speaking, we categorize autism spectrum disorder as developmental disability. I do have, I don't know, some opinions on that. Now, what I can tell you is that here are some typical symptoms that we know can be signs of autism, but often just sign of your overall delay. So not point at objects or show interest in things, not have that joint attention. So if I point to something and the child doesn't point to something or look that way, we see that the reciprocity isn't there, avoiding eye contacts, want to be alone. Some other things too is kind of, they might not like to be held, maybe unaware of their surroundings. They're not doing really what we call pretend play, and the repeated actions over and over again. So here's the challenge. And I tell anybody, therapist or parent, you have concerns, let's refer for an evaluation, because some of these things look like other things. That can look like hearing loss. This can look like just some motor delays. So those things, those next phases are delayed. Just your average speech and language delay. They can look like they might have signs of autism. So obviously, but what we do know, regardless whether anybody has autism or not, if you suspect or see signs of autism, a referral is always warranted. And that's where through the evaluation process, we kind of go through the checklist of things. So the other point I want to say too is that autism is kind of like you meet the criteria, and a lot of other disorders also meet the criteria. So that's what my problem is with kind of autism. I think it's way over identified. I think in the state of Arizona, I can speak to Arizona anyway, we have our state system division of developmental disabilities, and autism is one of those qualifying factors to get access to services provided by the state. And what's unfortunate is we have a lot of kids with this label because they need access to the resources. So sometimes autism is really the end game in order to get access to services that a child obviously needs. So regardless of the etiology, whether it's, you know, just your average developmental delay or autism or other issues with sensory, fine motor, gross motor, communication, we need our children to get access to those services. So I think in Arizona, there's an over-identified population who have a, you know, they can meet the criteria of autism, but you can have some sensory issues and a speech and language delay and not be autistic. High probability that you could be, so it's kind of one of those things where it looks like autism, we treat it like autism. If it becomes something different, awesome. So there's a little bit of that. So when in doubt, you're not sure, if you suspect a client you're treating, because oftentimes, sometimes you'll just get a child and it'll be, hey, they've got a speech and communication delay, but you see all these other things going on. Definitely alert your supervisor, especially if you suspect autism. So kind of be familiar with the signs and symptoms of autism. And truly, diagnosis, obviously, I want to say they go to a developmental pediatrician. Definitely that birth to 3 is critical, that they get support. And that's the other factor I have to say. I think what makes me sad, especially if I'm doing like preschool, those initial evals, and then a parent's like, well, I've always suspected some things off. That makes me sad because they could have maybe got access to some things earlier. And so always encourage anybody, you know, parents that you work with, family members, anybody, if they reach out to you, especially when they find out you're a speech therapist, they'll start asking you these questions. Definitely always say, when in doubt, get an eval, because that's the best way to go about it. The statistics. So I don't think they've increased. I think they're still 1 in 59. And then just to clear up any reoccurring vaccine, obviously the vaccines we've been talking about lately is COVID. There is no indication that vaccines cause autism. That's one particular article that came out has been completely found to be a fraud. So definitely some things. Now, hold on, let me go back to the read and review. So ASHA. And you will talk about autism in other classes. And what I want to say is truly what we do for autism is often what I would say not entirely different than what we do for other things, but obviously we're always focusing on communication. So regardless of the etiology, we're always focused on communication. So if you look at the new DSM-5, it's autism spectrum disorder. And even myself, I'm still working on this because that changed. When did that change? Recently. And I say recently in 2013. I still will say they used to kind of define it a little bit. Autism, Asperger's, and PDD, NOS. So I think a lot of kids fit the bill of PDD, NOS. So that's pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So this is where we see some things of autism and some other things that maybe are not autism. And so I did like that category, PDD, NOS. And where autism spectrum disorder, I think, was more traditionally those more severe, nonverbal, cognitively impaired people who had that category. That's typically what I would say they resembled. But autism spectrum is more inclusive. Autism spectrum to spectrum. We go from low functioning to high functioning. And when I say high functioning, the other thing I want to say a misnomer a little bit when I say low functioning, high functioning. Low functioning might be that they have limited cognition. They have maybe some pretty strong repetitive behaviors or some severe sensory challenges. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're always cognitively impaired. So there's high functioning, and just because somebody's quote unquote high functioning doesn't mean that they are functioning at a average level. So just some things, because I've known plenty of people with Asperger's who really struggle to function day to day, where maybe somebody who has what we would consider more low functioning on the spectrum is actually more, they manage their daily living skills a lot better, or have learned and gained those skills. So some other things too: Rett disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, those kind of went away. So you won't see it. You might see those terminologies on older reports if you're reviewing a file or you're working with a young adult. They may have had one of those labels. And really what I want to say is that Rett syndrome, and that's pretty severe. It's a genetic disorder and it's a separate diagnosis. So if you see Rett syndrome, you'll probably see Rett syndrome autism, but really Rett syndrome is a actual genetic disorder. So it's pretty intense. They would look like they have pretty significant autism. And then there's some other things too. Fragile X, I think here in Western states, we don't diagnose that well. Fragile X is another one that's a genetic disorder. Looks very similar to autism. I think in other states, sometimes they do a better job of making people get genetic testing before they get a diagnosis of autism. I don't know, I've seen that hit or miss. Sometimes they will do some genetic testing, especially if somebody goes to MELMED. So just those are some changes. So I just want to go. So kind of you can look at what's within our scope. And obviously, I just want to point out, I would say we have at least good evidence-based practices coming out for our clients with autism. I think we have most up-to-date research to the best that we can on all things autism. So that's what's fun about the fun, I guess I call it fun. But what's interesting and great to see about all the research related to autism, a lot of that looks at the speech and language intervention for them. So obviously it's a whole thing in and of itself. But let's say you have a client with autism, they're nonverbal and you're working on augmentative communication. That might look the same with another client who maybe has, let's say, cerebral palsy, let's say, and they have limited verbal output. What you do in activities might look the same to practice and use their augmentative communication devices. Maybe how information is presented, maybe some of those things change based on other needs. So just know, you suspect autism, you know the client you're working with doesn't have that diagnosis, please talk to your supervisor. It's always good for us to kind of be aware so we can make the appropriate referrals. So on this, definitely you guys need to be kind of up to date on some of the prevalence. Like I said, yeah, it was 2013 when the DSM-5 changed. Know the common features and common difficulties. So again, these are stereotypes. But I will tell you, let's say just because a child has good language skills doesn't mean that they don't have autism. For instance, you might see a verbal child who have limited or absent imaginative play, or less able to interact with the world, or poor social awareness. Now, poor social awareness can be a lot of disorders, not just autism, but kind of our reading cues. So this is where sometimes I'll see maybe a client that maybe truly has some severe ADHD, but could look like they're on the spectrum. Attention deficit disorder often is comorbid with autism. So there is some, I was trying to find it, I don't remember, I think it's more European stuff, but there are some people that kind of call autism, you know, the extreme end of attention deficit. I can kind of see where that kind of leap goes there. But common difficulties, often, but not always, experienced by a child with autism spectrum disorder, is poor understanding of conventions of social interaction. Now, but I want to tell you, let's say you have a 9-year-old with autism spectrum disorder and you feel like their social is pretty good. They may have learned those skills. They may have been in intervention, benefited from that, and it's improved. So because you don't always get to see clients on the spectrum from when they first diagnosed to where they end up, I'm sure all of us have encountered adults who probably are on the spectrum somewhere. So deficits in developing and maintaining relationships. So we might see where they can interact, but they can't maintain the relationship. Limited play interest. So those restrictive interests, difficulty sharing in and using imaginative play. And that's that social emotional reciprocity. So stereotyped or repetitive speech, poor motor movements or use of objects. So this might where we see, you know, this one little boy, he likes to just like take things and run it across the table. Like he does this over and over again. Doesn't matter what's in his hand. He does it, you know, it looks like he's trying to do like what you do with a car, you know, kind of when little boys play with the car, but he just does this with whatever's in his hand. And I was telling the intern I have right now, I'm like, hey, that's definitely stereotype or repetitive behaviors. So motor movements, use of objects, the echolalia, repetitive use of objects, and hand flapping. So the flapping, you see flapping on a regular basis. One time you see hand flapping does not mean they're autism. Lots of hand flapping all the time on a regular basis definitely could be autism. It could be a sensory issue too. So just because you have a sensory issue doesn't mean you have autism either. Excessive adherence to routine and rules, that, you know, hyper or hyporeactivity sensory input, don't initiate conversation with others, resistant to change or very rigid in routine, can be impulsive or aggressive. So let me see. So let's look at our therapy observation. Hold on. My twins love to knock on the door. You guys stop. You need to stop. So sorry. Definitely everyone's ready for the school year to be done. Okay. There's one master clinician. If you've already watched this one, look for some of those specific signs of autism for sure. Definitely that empathy from the clinician. And then there's the compare and contrast therapy reflection. Oh, whoops, hold on. This is one. Sorry, 1 second. So look at the difference between autism therapy, the autism therapy observation 1 and then observation 2. So the child that's 2 or 3 years, and then the other one, the child is 1 second. It's an adult. So there's a difference between, I think it's a younger adult, not an older adult. They've kind of changed these around, but definitely look at, compare and contrast those two therapy observations. Nope, wrong one. Okay, I'm gonna ask you. 1 second. And then, oh, hold on. I hate when those come up as quizzes. So definitely look through the new information. So we have autism is a widely known disorder. So please indicate at least one new concept about autism that you didn't know before. And, you know, obviously use proper grammar and syntax. But obviously, I think a lot of us are well informed about autism. But, you know, look through the literature. I think there's only one other point I want to point out. Like I said, prevalence is important. The signs of autism are important to know. And the other piece, kind of be familiar with when the diagnosis changed. Oh, here we go. what are some of the interventions? So the other piece I wanted, so here's occupational therapy, but this can also relate to speech for sure. So I like this because it really highlights social stories. So as an SLPA, you will, as those of you who saw it last week, I had some interesting social stories up that I have been collecting for a young adolescent who's having some difficulty about appropriate, learning about himself. So social stories definitely help provide a lot of helpful ways to intervene and intervention, school transition, visual cues, routines. So obviously when you see the words visual schedule, you might use a visual schedule in therapy. So it's like, we're going to do work, then we're going to have a break, then we're going to get to go jump on the trampoline, then we're going to come in. So a lot of times that what we call visual cues, visual schedule helps them predict what's going to come next. And using a routine, I highly recommend any kind of therapy you do with anybody on the spectrum. A routine is helpful. It helps get them engaged quicker. Once they've been with you a few times, it's really helpful. For instance, we have one little boy and we're working with his AAC. He knows he gets to go to different stations and we do some language concepts, with each one. And he knows the routine. He comes to speech, that's what we do. Where we do something, at this part of the room, that part of the room, this part of the room. And he's got to, use his device the whole time. So that definitely helped us keep some of his other behaviors and things under control. So if they have behaviors too, that routine piece will help. So, and then sensory processing, definitely get some help from your supervisor about what are some sensory activities, or if you have accessibility to the OT or the occupational therapist that's working with them on a regular basis, definitely ask about some of the sensory processing and some sensory things to do. Because I will tell you, even though you're not the OT, you're using them to help, them participate, pay attention, calm. So those are all things I really like. And so be familiar with kind of those interventions, because just because it says OT doesn't mean speech doesn't use them, as well as things that are speech doesn't mean OT doesn't use them. And that really, we're really working on the communication piece. It's not always verbal. And obviously, as they develop language, then we're working on conversation skills as well as concepts. And kind of what I would say, those higher level things, we're really working on empathy, non-literal language, and emotions. So definitely what we do know, here are some things that a person with autism might have difficulty with. A lot of these are similar to other disorders. So the nice thing is, a lot of times, regardless of the disorder, we know here are some challenges that we might be working on. And even some things too, we might work on the verbalization to help self-regulate. Like for instance, this little guy I was talking about, the intern was struggling today with him. The other therapist who works with him forever, we were all struggling a little bit. And we were talking about, when he hits, and we really work on the verbiage. He was hitting because he was frustrated. So we work on what's the replacement behavior for that. So things like that. And that's where too, you need to work with his therapy, his other therapists, and his family and his team, definitely working together on, what are the vocabulary working? What are the ways we're working on some of those replacement behaviors? So be familiar. So that's what I like about this. I think it's really great to see what are some interventions and strategies that speech therapy and OT use. And obviously you suspect autism, definitely evaluation is always warranted. So any other questions? So look at those two observations, then compare and contrast them. What looked different for a young child versus an adult? What are some things that maybe were the same? What are some things, did you notice routine-based? Did you notice other strategies, visual cues? Did they use a social story? Did you see some of those interventions that we just kind of have talked about in any of those sessions? And then the read and review. Any other questions? All right, if not, thank you for joining me.